Hello there, everyone. So, I'd promised earlier this week that if I didn't have my new essay that I've been talking about completed and uploaded, I would try something new and which I believe many of you would find interesting. It's a semi-scripted video, but framed around a personal experience. So, I'd have the ability to finish the entire video in about an hour or two. It ended up taking like 3 days, but that's aside from the point. Depending on how well this video does or how helpful it is, I may consider making more like it, so make sure to comment and rate telling me what you think. It's appreciated and immensely helpful for shaping the future content on this channel. Anyway, let's just cut to the chase, because there's not too much really to get out of the way in prefacing this. It's a first-hand account, but for legal reasons, I can't delve into too many specifics, though despite this setback, I still have quite a bit to talk about, so don't worry about that. So for those of you who don't know, because I know a large chunk of my full audience is not in our Discord, where I occasionally talk about my work offline, I managed to obtain a relatively consistent gig as a welder's assistant in a local gray market counter economy around late September of last year. In as much detail as I could possibly go before I begin to provide compromising information, how I was able to establish this connection was through meeting my now boss and work partner at a local farmer's market. He wasn't a merchant. How I managed to meet up with him was that I heard him talking with one of the merchants about how much debt that his home was in from the person who I was about to buy some coffee from, and how he'd recently set up a shop in his shed to weld along with smelt metals as a means to help pay off his debt. I offered to help him because around this time my microgreens weren't growing, since I don't have any sort of indoor means to control the temperature at which they were growing around, and my 3D printer's Z-axis motor broke, which were my previous two main sources of income and counter-economic activity. So I needed a fucking job in pronto. So I struck up conversation with the guy. I told him that I had experience trading in the gray market as a merchant and entrepreneur, which I was kind of surprised, admittedly, that he was familiar with the term gray market. Thought I was gonna have to elaborate, but I digress. And I proceeded to also explain that I had an interest in learning how to weld myself, and I would like to know if he'd be okay with me working with him as an apprentice and letting me help him around his shop for a fee. Thankfully, being a middle-aged Mormon, this guy was pretty open and welcoming to my suggestion and offered to allow me to work with him, train me on some of the basics, and would pay me in either sunflower seeds or wheatgrass in an amount which added up roughly to $20 in market value per hour of work. And I'll preface this by saying that I admittedly was a bit nervous about a gray market job at first. It's a new experience, and I think it would be easy to say that this was somewhat of a product of deeply ingrained state propaganda, as a lot of libertarians probably would attribute these sort of initial anxieties to. Although I had experience with entrepreneurial trading in gray markets, as already stated, I knew this type of association had an entirely different dynamic in the sense that I didn't own the resources I was working with, and I assumed that I would therefore lose some ability to operate around my own schedule, and as someone with a really high time preference, that's a deal breaker for me, you know? I don't care how many resources I have so long as I'm in as much control over my own schedule as possible. In hindsight, what I ended up coming to experience as a gray market laborer, particularly with the more specialized tasks, and if your place of work is also a gray market firm, seems pretty obvious with what we're able to observe about market activity. But what I found is that gray market capitalists, using that term in the economic, not political sense, have a radically different set of incentives and tendencies in the relations with their employees and management structure in contrast with white market firms. Firstly, as a laborer, you have much greater leverage over your position in a gray market business. Now, I assume that the extent to which this is true varies depending on the work one specializes in and the way that a firm they work for organizes itself or is associated with in their business partners. For instance, if you're working under the table at McDonald's as a janitor, then you'll probably end up in a less profitable relationship than if you were to work in the white market for McDonald's or a comparable firm as a janitor. Because on top of the fact that janitorial work requires a very limited set of specialized skills to perform, making any particular janitor incredibly easy to replace, McDonald's, as not only a white market firm, but a corporation, receives various state-enforced legal privileges, which put it in a disproportionate position of leverage over its so-called entry-level workers. Here are several of them on screen so that I don't have to waste too much time going over them. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them, so obviously this isn't going to be a complete list, and with hundreds of new legislative decrees being created every single day, it would be literally impossible to name every single one. But what you need to know is that there are legislative decrees which white market firms, especially corporations, benefit directly from, which allow them to claim certain unique legal statuses in state-enforced arbitration, or incentivize them to scale more than they naturally would be able to while maintaining net gains due to subsidies, finance manipulation, and cartelization enforced by the state, which in turn make said firms massively inefficient, along with reducing any incentives they have to cooperate and compete with other firms or workers within their own firm. This ends up creating an artificially limited amount of both quantity of feedback and ways in which said feedback can be used by the firm in question, in turn limiting how the firm is able to evaluate the marginal efficiency of each individual worker. I personally have a family member who worked essentially in this exact position, but for a local unspecified white market business. Their wage was $3 lower than the white market wages. They didn't receive any of the benefits the white market employees did working in the exact same position. They were scheduled to work whenever they were called, whereas everybody else had a preset schedule. And on top of that, if they quit their job, the firm in question was able to threaten them with calling the police, and it's very likely that my family member would have been thrown in jail when the firm would have probably only had to pay a $100 fine. So they had to work there essentially until the firm went defunct. What I'm saying, in other words, is that I really fucking don't recommend getting a gray market job for a white market firm, because all that is going to do is completely screw you. But on the other hand, my experience has been probably one of the best jobs I've ever had. For one thing, I don't have a set schedule at all, nor am I on any sort of call duty. I can essentially show up whenever I want, any day of the week, and that's just to be expected. The only caveat, as specified by the owner of my place of work, is that I show up between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. If I wanted to work 7 days for 12 hours a day, I could do that. If I wanted to work once an hour or two out of an entire week, I could do that as well. Now, I get messages occasionally asking for help, and so far I've never turned one down, but those are incredibly rare, and I've been told specifically that I wouldn't be penalized if I didn't show up on request, but I need the money, and I like the guy that I work with, honestly, just as a person, so I admittedly would just feel pretty guilty if I were to ignore it. Not going to specify my routine, but I work around part-time hours, and yet I make enough to pay most of my bills. Secondly, since gray market firms aren't corporations and don't have any ties to financial markets, they don't have any of the sort of dysgenic incentives created by stock holding and banking manipulation, which when I started, I was only admittedly beginning to explore the sort of incentives for firms created by the state's manipulation of finance, so it caught me genuinely off guard when I'd been working for over a month and my boss expressed consistently a pretty lackadaisical attitude at most with getting more customers, because up until that point, every firm that I'd worked for was in the white market, and my entire conception of what a business was that they're not only fundamentally profit-seeking in a material sense, but that as a natural result of this, they're inherently incentivized to scale upwards to try and obtain a greater share of the market. And this may potentially still be the case for some people who have very low time preferences, of course, ignoring the realities of diseconomy of scale. But what I found, which again in hindsight, with more knowledge now on this subject, thanks mainly to the work of the Molinari Institute, the ALL Archive, Bleeding Heart Libertarians, among other sites, which I'll post links to in the pinned comment, is unsurprisingly and predictably that my entire conception of how firms modeled themselves was fundamentally flawed, as well as that of most people whom I've spoken to, given that the sort of assumptions that I was working from also seem to be pretty mainstream. As it turns out, competition only incentivizes growth to a certain extent, and that extent is determined mainly by the owner of the firm and how much profit they gain from actually running a business that size. Because as it turns out, even the people who actually finance the firms and manage the resources, they have varying degrees of time preference, which is why in hindsight, it really should have seemed pretty obvious to me that my conception that every entrepreneur and every capitalist was just someone who had a really low time preference is wrong. But this sense of profit gained from seeking perpetual growth, the notion that this is a thing for any firm as a speculator, that exists, but that is mostly incentivized by state coercion through the aforementioned means. Because what I found is that gray market firms tend to be very localized, since in counter economies, entrepreneurship, running a firm, or being a laborer is not something which profit can only be derived from, depending on time preference associated with that role. That in turn also makes the work environment, so to speak, feel much less strenuous, almost as if collaborating on some sort of project as opposed to a rank-and-file professional environment. Again, I apologize for not going into much personal detail, however, I felt that I needed to make this video, at the very least outlining my experience, because I haven't been putting out much content lately. But also, my experience sheds some light on some very interesting revelations. I doubt that I am alone in my initial feelings of hesitation towards actually going out and looking for an anarcho job. In hindsight, I really shouldn't have been as anxious as I was, knowing what I know about how the state influences white market firms, given that gray market capitalists and entrepreneurs don't have any of these sort of incentives, and on top of the extra incentives to cooperate, given that both them and their workers are being antagonized by the state in the exact same way for merely making the money that they're making, this being true for the boss or speculator to an even greater extent, because if the state does find out what's going on, they're going to lose all their capital, and whereas a laborer is only going to get a fine, they're probably going to end up with a prison sentence. State propaganda aside, which realistically is probably a very minor factor in determining whether or not someone derives profit from going out and seeking a gray market job. I mean, if the state tells you and tries to manipulate you into not seeing food as being important, you're still gonna feel hungry, so you're gonna go out and try and look for food. And there's very little that state propaganda is going to do to try and change that. But I understand that there's a very real factor which prevents most people from actually looking for revolutionary employment or speculating with some of their assets and creating a gray market firm. Well, two of them, and they were the same two reasons which initially kept me from doing so for as long as I did, and they kind of play off of each other. It being almost impossibly difficult to find a gray market job, and there being little to no asset security with an increased sense of risk due to state aggression actively and constantly threatening to fuck up your life. I didn't create this video to brag or show off. I created this video to try and help paint a more clear picture and give a better impression of what's possible for anyone of any marginal preference through counter-economic means to obtain for themselves. More importantly, to further demonstrate the necessity of decentralized networking, such as through Fnet, which allow people to communicate privately through peer-to-peer channels and consequently trade more securely to actually establish a subversive infrastructure of agoras which more people can take part in. It's seriously one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had, and I know if we could work to actually create an infrastructure around this as agorists and counter-economists, the state definitely would not be able to continue functioning as it does. I already knew this through observation to a large extent. You know, we have historical evidence of this, and we have all the right economic information to sort of prove this point. You know, I've read the works of Konkin and whatever, I understand how human action works, but what this experience has shown me more than I've already known through observation, and what I don't think a lot of people realize yet, a lot of agorists don't, is that general employment in the counter-economy, even despite the insecurity, is already more profitable, generally speaking, than white market employment. It has more points of utility, and it is more workable for a greater amount of people. There's a much smaller barrier of entry, and more people derive a greater sense of profit from associating like this. And I think that a big part of why exactly it is that agorists don't focus on creating these sort of subversive infrastructures is because they don't think gray market trade is profitable yet. Well, in truth, it is. People would gladly accept one of these jobs, and these jobs would dominate if it were more accessible and more secure. I admittedly had this view of counter-economies for a very long time as well. This is not something by any means that one should feel guilty of. Speaking of which, brief update on Fnet, since a lot of people have been wondering how that's been going for the last month or so, since we've been pretty dead quiet about it since the day that we said that the project was going to be done. Yeah, well, the problem is that it probably would have been done by January 31st. It's just that we've had a lot of problems with people having issues in their personal lives and not being able to actually contribute as frequently both personal problems and financial problems, so progress has ground to a halt for the time being, but within the next month, we should get up and working on that relatively consistently. We do have some progress to show from it, though. If you have a Pine phone, we have a localized server which we have yet to demonstrate, but we'll get around to demonstrating that, which allows you to make calls and make texts without needing a cell phone provider. But yes, I apologize for the lack of information about that and the lack of progress on that. That project is still going on. We just sort of need to re-coordinate what we're doing. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, again, please comment, rate, subscribe. It's greatly appreciated. We have 3 essays so far, which are already completed. We just, one of them is a collaboration among 3 people, so it's taking a while to get everybody's parts together. That'll probably be up within the next week or so. One of them's recorded. One of them's written entirely. Sorry, I misspoke. But I haven't actually taken the time to record it yet. Plus, there's like a paragraph or 2 that I need to add at the end. Like, the last couple paragraphs aren't completed, I don't think. That'll be up within, the next week or so. Sometime in March, for sure. And I've already, I've already gotten to the end of the video that I'm working on after that, which is going to be probably one of the more interesting ones by far. So there's a lot to look forward to this next month. I'm saying this because February was a lackluster month. One upload is kinda shit, so March is not going to be like that, and I can't say that April will be either. We're gonna really start picking up the pace here. The hiatus is over, and yeah, as you can tell by the fact that I'm saying a lot to sort of carry my thoughts, this segment here was largely unscripted, whereas the rest of the video was semi-scripted. Anyway, I'll see you all later.